Hi Year 5 again. Okay, back with chapter 3 of our book, The Land of Stories. Now before we get started, just to let you know, I've set some e-safety work on Purple Mash because whilst you're working at home and using your home learning, you need to make sure that you're staying safe online. So remember your SMART rules and think about all of those things. I've sent some PowerPoints home for your parents to go through with you so that you can think about how to stay safe online, okay? So we'll start with chapter 3, which is called A Birthday Surprise. Pencils down, Mrs. Peters ordered from the front of the classroom. Her students were taking a math test, and she had been watching them like a prison guard the entire time. Pass your tests to the front. Connor looked down at the test as if it was written in ancient hieroglyphics. Most of his answers were blank, and he had just scribbled around the others to make it look like he had at least tried. He said a little prayer to himself and passed the test forward with the others. The tests were all passed to Alex, who stacked them in a neat pile for Mrs. Peters. She always felt so refreshed after taking a test, especially one as simple as that one had been for her. Her brother's test caught her eye, since it was the one with the least amount of writing on it. Alex knew Connor always tried his best at school, but his best never seemed to be good enough. She looked back at him, wishing she could help him, and then it occurred to her, maybe she could. Alex looked up to Mrs. Peters and saw that she was busy looking at the notes in her lesson plan. Would her teacher notice if Alex quickly filled in a couple of answers for her brother? Was Alex even capable of doing something so blatantly wrong? Was it considered cheating if you were doing it on someone else's test? Would the gracious gesture cancel out the offence in the grand scheme of things? Alex was prone to overthinking everything, so she just did it. She quickly filled in some of her brother's answers, making her handwriting slightly sloppier than it usually was, and handed the stack of tests to Mrs. Peters. It was the most spontaneous thing she had ever done. "Thank you, Miss Bailey," Mrs. Peters said, making eye contact with her. Alex felt the pit of her stomach had fallen out of her body. The excitement she had felt from her impulse was now overshadowed by guilt. Mrs. Peters has always trusted her. How could she do something so juvenile? Should she confess what she had done? What was the punishment for a crime? Would she feel this guilty for the rest of her life? She looked back at her brother. Connor let out a long but quiet sigh, and Alex sensed her brother's sadness and embarrassment. She could feel his hopelessness as if it were her own. The critical wheels in Alex's head stopped turning. She knew she'd done the right thing, not as a student, but as a sister. "I want you all to get out your homework from last night," Mrs. Peters commanded, "and I would like you to briefly present your work in front of the class." The teacher regularly surprised the class with impromptu presentations to keep them on their toes. She took a seat on a stool in the back of the room, uncomfortably close to Connor's seat, so she could keep an eye on his consciousness. One by one, the students presented their assignments to the class. Besides a boy who thought Jack and the Beanstalk was about an alien abduction and a girl who claimed Puss in Boots was an early example of animal cruelty, all the students seemed to have interpreted their tales correctly. "It was so hard to choose just one fairy tale to write about," Alex said as she animatedly presented her 7-page paper to the class. "So, I selected the story, the theme of which is present in virtually every fairy tale and every story ever written. Cinderella." Her excitement was not shared by her peers. Many people have had issues with Cinderella, saying it has anti-feminist elements, Alex continued. "But I think that's completely ridiculous. Cinderella is not about a man saving a woman. It's about karma." Most of the class began daydreaming about other things. Mrs. Peters was the only person in the room who seemed even slightly interested in what Alex had to say. "Think about it," Alex went on. "Even after years of constant abuse from her stepmother and her stepsisters, Cinderella remained a good person with high hopes. She never stopped believing in herself and in the good of the world. And although she was married to the prince in the end, Cinderella always had inner happiness. Her story shows that even the worst of situations, even when it seems no one in the world appreciates you, as long as you have hope, everything can get better. Alex let her mind linger on what she said. She questioned the last point she had made in her presentation. Was that really what Cinderella was about? Or was it what she needed Cinderella to be about? Thank you, Miss Bailey. Very well said, Mrs. Peters said, with the closest thing to a smile her face was capable of making. Thank you for your time, Alex said, and nodded to the class. It's your turn, Mr. Bailey, the teacher announced. She was sitting so close to him that he could feel the warm breath from her nostrils on the back of his neck. Connor went to the front of the classroom, dragging his feet as if they were encased in concrete. He had never had trouble talking in front of the class, but he'd rather be anywhere in the world than presenting something in front of a teacher. Alex gave him an encouraging nod. I chose The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Connor said, going against his sister's advice from the day before. Alex slumped in her seat and Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes. This was very disappointing. I know you're all thinking, I went with the easiest, Connor said. Except, reading it again, I don't think the story is about the importance of honesty. I think it's about high expectations. Alex and Mrs. Peters both raised an eyebrow. Where was he going with this? Sure, the boy was a brat. I can't deny that, Connor continued, gesturing to the half-page paper he had written. But can you blame him for having a little fun? Clearly his village was having a bit of a wolf problem, and everyone was stressed out about it. He was just a kid. Did they really expect him to be perfect all the time? His presentation may not have been the best, but it certainly was catching the class's attention. And it makes me wonder, why was no one else watching this kid? Connor added. Maybe if his parents had kept an eye on him, he wouldn't have been eaten. I think the story is trying to tell us to keep an eye on our kids, especially if they're liars. Thank you. Connor never tried to be funny. He was just painfully honest about his thoughts and opinions. This honesty always amused his classmates, but never his teachers. Thank you, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters said sharply. You may sit down now. Connor knew he'd blown it. He took his seat, resuming the position under his teacher's cold stare and warm breath. Why did he even bother trying any more? It wasn't the end of a school day unless Connor left feeling completely worthless. There was only one person who was capable of making him feel better when he felt this way. Connor only wished he was still around. Mr. Bailey always knew when his son needed to talk to him. It didn't have anything to do with observation or intuition, but with location. Occasionally, Mr. Bailey would get home from work and find his son sitting up in the oak tree in the front yard with a contemplative look on his face. Connor, Mr. Bailey would ask, approaching the tree. Is everything okay, bud? Uh-huh, Connor would mumble. Are you sure? Mr. Bailey would ask. Yup, Connor would say unconvincingly. He wasn't as vocal about his troubles as his sister was, but you could see it in his face. Mr. Bailey would climb up the tree and have a seat on the branch next to his son and coax out what was troubling him. Are you sure you don't want to talk about it? Mr. Bailey would continue. Did something happen at school today? Connor would nod his head. Got a bad grade on my test, he admitted on one occasion. Did you study for it? His father asked. Yes, Connor said. I studied really hard, Dad, but it's just no use. I'll never be as smart as Alex. His cheeks turned bright red with embarrassment. Connor, let me fill you in on something that took me a long time to learn, Mr. Bailey said. The woman in your life, or the women in your life, are always going to seem smarter. It's just the way it is. I've been married to your mother for 13 years, and I still have trouble keeping up with her. You can't compare yourself to others. But I'm stupid, Dad, Connor said, his eyes filling with tears. I find that hard to believe, Mr. Bailey said. It takes intelligence to be funny and tell a good joke, and you're the funniest kid I know. Humour doesn't help with history or math, Connor said. It doesn't matter how hard I try in school, I'm always going to be the dumb kid in the class. Connor's face went white and expressionless. He stared off into nothing, so ashamed of himself that it hurt. Luckily for him, Mr. Bailey had an encouraging story for every situation. Connor, have I ever told you the legend about the walking fish? Mr. Bailey asked him. He looked up at his father. The walking fish? Connor asked. Dad, no offence, but I don't think one of your stories is going to make me feel better this time. All right, suit yourself, Mr. Bailey said. A few moments later, and Connor's curiosity got the best of him. OK, you can tell me about the walking fish, Connor said. Mr. Bailey's eyes lit up, as they always did just before he was going to tell a story. Connor could tell this was going to be a good one. Once upon a time, there was a large fish who lived in a lake by himself, Mr. Bailey told him. Every day, the fish would watch longingly as a boy from the village nearby would play with all the horses and dogs and squirrels on land. Is a dog going to die in this story, Dad? Connor interrupted. You know I hate stories when dogs die. Let me finish, Mr. Bailey went on. One day, a fairy came to the lake and granted the fish a wish. That's random, Connor said. Why do fairies always just show up and do nice things for people they don't know? Employment obligation, Mr. Bailey shrugged. But for argument's sake, let's say she dropped her wand in the lake and the fish retrieved it. So she offered him a wish as a thank you. Happy? That's better, Connor said. Go on. The fish predictably wished for legs so he could play with the boy from the village, Mr. Bailey said. So the fairy turned his fins into legs and he became the walking fish. That's weird, Connor said. Let me guess. The fish was so freaky looking the boy never wanted to play with him. Nope. They become great friends and played together with all the other land animals, Mr. Bailey told him. But one day, the boy fell into the lake and couldn't swim. The walking fish tried to save him, but it was no use. He didn't have his fins anymore, so sadly the boy drowned. Connor's mouth hung open like a broken glove compartment. You see, if the fish had just stayed in the lake and not wished to be something else, he could have saved the boy's life, Mr. Bailey finished. Dad, that's a horrible story, he said. How did a boy live by a lake and not know how to swim? Dogs can swim. Couldn't one of them saved him? Where was that fairy when the boy was drowning? I think you're missing the point of the story, Mr. Bailey said. Sometimes we forget about our own advantages because we focus on what we don't have. Just because you have to work a little harder at something that seems easier to others doesn't mean you're without your own talents. Connor thought about this for a moment. I think I get it, Dad, he said. Mr. Bailey smiled at him. Now, why don't we get down from this tree and I'll help you study for your next test? I told you studying doesn't help, Connor said. I've tried and tried and tried, but it never helps. Then we'll come up with our own way of studying, Mr. Bailey told him. We'll look at pictures of people in your history book and make up jokes about them so you'll remember their names. And we'll create funny scenarios to help you with all those math formula. Connor slowly but surely nodded and agreed to it. Fine, he said with half a smile. But for future reference, I liked your story about the curvy tree much better. And we'll stop it there. We've still got about 10 pages left of chapter 3, so we'll finish those tomorrow. I hope you're enjoying the book. I know I am, and I sometimes can't wait to read this book. It's sometimes the best part of my day, so I really look forward to reading this. I will see you tomorrow. Okay, remember what we said about the e-safety as well. Remember your SMART rules. Complete those units on Purple Mash. And I will see you tomorrow. Bye.